I'm doing it right now.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Anarita Bashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guests. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Professor Victor Fett.
Thank you. It's my pleasure and honor today to welcome Dr. Taras Kuzio, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and also Associate Fellow at the Forum for Foreign Relations. Dr. Kuzio, who joins us from across the Atlantic, has been a winner of the 2022 Peterson Literary Prize for his book, Russian Nationalism and the Russian-Ukrainian War, Autocracy-Orthodoxy-Nationality, and the book appeared before the full-scale invasion. Dr. Kuzio, welcome to 137th weekly meeting of Marshall University Discussion Group, MUkraine. The microphone is yours. Please share your screen with us.
Okay. So my screen's not shared at the moment?
Is it?
I think so.
We're good.
Okay, yeah, because I
Okay.
have a PowerPoint up, so everybody can
Yes.
see the PowerPoint? Okay. I wanted to use this occasion to, I mean, the war going on in Ukraine has so many kind of aspects to it, and I could have chosen any one of those, but because of the upcoming US presidential elections and the strategic importance of those elections for Ukraine, for Europe, and of course for the United States itself, I wanted to talk more about how the war in Ukraine fits into the kind of bigger picture of what I would call, and other, of course, scholars have called in foreign affairs and elsewhere, this axis of upheaval. President Bush, just before launching the intervention in Iraq, called it an axis of evil. Then it was slightly different countries, but basically talking about the same thing. So it's been called various things, but by axis of upheaval, we're talking about Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So let's start. I think one of the kind of misconceptions, largely, I think, given by Western journalists who love a bit of sensationalism, that, you know, we're in a disaster area. These populist nationalist forces are taking over everywhere, and they're all pro-Russian. I think that's exaggerated, and I think that we need to sort of look at this a bit more nuanced. For example, even on Trump, and I'm by no means a fan of Donald Trump, but let's look at Donald Trump. I mean, he, in his presidency, 2016, 2020, he was actually tougher against Russia than President Obama, and actually tougher than President Biden just before the Russian invasion of 2022. He imposed sanctions against Nord Stream 2, the German-Russian gas pipeline, which went under the Baltic Sea. And unlike Obama vetoed the sending of military equipment to Ukraine. Trump did not veto that sending. So some military equipment, not a lot, but some went to Ukraine in the sort of about 2019. But what's changed with Trump is that he's become very angry, that's his personality. He's become very angry and very anti-Ukrainian since 2020 when he was first impeached. Because of course Zelensky did not agree to work with Trump and Giuliani on trying to dig up dirt on Biden, and he blames Zelensky for his first impeachment, and as all of these kind of populist nationalists, they love conspiracies, so he believes there's a conspiracy between Zelensky in bed with the Democrats against him. So there is Trump from 16 to 20, and then there's Trump since 20. They're quite different. What will happen now if Trump is elected is anybody's guess, but it doesn't look very good for Ukraine. The European version of Trump is, of course, Hungary's Obama. You would need a psychologist, not a political scientist, to try to understand the leader of Hungary, because this is a country that had a very brutal Soviet occupation. Unlike Czechoslovakia in 68, in 1956 in Hungary, there was a popular kind of war against the Soviet invading forces. Lots of people were killed. And yet, this is a country which has a political party, Fidesz, and leader Oban, who is very, very pro-Russian and pro-Chinese. I mean, he's completely in bed with Russia, very anti-Ukrainian, and that's unusual as well. Very hostile to Brussels. But of course, none of these populist nationalists in Eastern Europe ever have the bravado to actually call for a Brexit from the European Union, because they know the population would never support that. But nevertheless, he's a strange outlier, and as I say, you would need more a psychologist than a political scientist to try to understand Hungary's leaders. Now, populist nationalists in Germany and Austria are also pro-Russian. In Germany, they feed off particularly a kind of pro-Russian or pro-Soviet sentiment in the former GDR, East Germany. Austria is again a strange case, because Ukraine has Western Ukraine has very fond memories of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It was far more tolerant of Ukraine identity than the Russian Empire. So Austria is a strange case of having quite a sizable pro-Russian sentiment. But at the same time, there are populist nationalists throughout Europe, including my own country, Britain. You know, we unfortunately voted for Brexit, and people who were from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party voted for Brexit. But you don't have any pro-Russian sentiment in Britain at all, and not at all. In Scandinavia, similarly, you have populist nationalists in Denmark, which are very influential, Sweden, Finland, but they are not pro-Russian. Poland, it's the former government, the Law and Justice Party, is very similar to Hungary's, but again, very anti-Russian, not pro-Russian. Italy, similarly, and also Holland. So it's a mixed picture. It's not true to say that all populist nationalists are bad for Ukraine and are pro-Russian. In France, which has, of course, Le Pen's daughter and the former National Front, now the National Rally, they have very much toned down their pro-Russianism because it's not very popular in France. In Holland, they had to tone it down completely because most of the passengers on MH17, the civilian airliner shot down by Russia in July 2014, were, of course, Dutch people. So I think in this bigger picture, Trump and Hungary are kind of outliers. They're not very typical of everywhere. One of the aspects of this kind of populist nationalism is just their love of conspiracies. And this is fed, of course, by Russia, because Russia's ruled by what's in Russian called siloviki, people from the security forces, particularly former KGB officers like Putin, and they just live in the world of conspiracies. They inherited that from the Soviet Union. Every dissident, every nationalist, everybody against the Soviet regime was supposedly in the pay of the CIA or Mossad or the British intelligence service MI6, and that's continued to this day. And so the democratic revolutions, like the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Euromaidan Revolution, were not real protest movements. They were organized by the CIA. That's the world, the bizarre world that they live in. And of course, that leads to an underestimation of Ukrainian identity, because they can't see a real identity. They just see puppets of the West, which of course they found to their mistake that's not true. The war is still going on. And so that feeds into a kind of an idea that somehow Ukrainian identity is artificial. This is a fiction that has been revived from the Tsarist era, from the late 19th century, that Ukrainian identity was always artificial. It was always promoted by enemies of Russia to divide the so-called Russian people. By Russian people here, they mean the Eastern Slavs as one people. So in Russian, Общий русский народ, pan-Russian people, great little and white Russians. But this leads to a bizarre coalition of conspirators. The Austrians and the Poles in the late 19th century, Vladimir Lenin for giving Ukraine a republic, and now the CIA. That's a very bizarre kind of group of allies. And one of the big arguments made by Russia as they launched the invasion in 2022, that the West allegedly had transformed Ukraine into this anti-Russia. And this was a security threat to Russia. And of course, Russia always talks about this concept of Russophobia. If you're a critic of Putin, of the regime, you're a Russophobe. This video is from a really good website and information office created by the European Union in 2015 to collect all of this Russian disinformation about the West, about Ukraine. I really recommend visiting this website. This kind of conspiracy feeds into the kind of
Просто нагло обманули. Нас просто водили за нос, обманывали. Нас просто надули. Обманули дурачка на 4 кулачка. Кинули просто. Грубо кинули. К сожалению, нас в очередной раз обманули, надули. Нас обманули в очередной раз, как я уже сказал. Цинично обманули. Просто водили нас за нос, обманывали. Не в первый раз такое с нами происходит. По плану. Часто так бывает с нашими западными партнерами. Они нас опять надули.
This sort of idea that the West has always been a conspiracy against Russia is I think the origins of this lie in this centuries-old inferiority complex that Russia has always had vis-a-vis the West. Somehow that the West is trying to pull the wool over the eyes of Russians. If that's really true, as what Putin is saying, then it doesn't say very much good about how the Russian intelligence services are operating. If the West can keep pulling the wool over Russia's eyes, then the Russian intelligence services are doing a very bad job. But there you are.
Кому-то нравится разделять Украину и Россию. Они считают, что это чрезвычайно важная задача. Потому что любое объединение России и Украины, их возможностей и конкурентных преимуществ, это создание конкурентов, глобального конкурента в Европе и в мире. И никто этого не хочет. Поэтому будут делать все, чтобы нас растаскивали.
Here we have confirmation that Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, was correct when he wrote in 1994 that Russia cannot be an empire without Ukraine. This is Putin's basically saying this. But he's also saying that the West is allegedly preventing this unification. Russia here claims that it knows the wishes of Ukrainians better than Ukrainians themselves. That these Ukrainians are just themselves have been hoodwinked by the West into believing they're somehow different to Russians when they're really little Russians. They just, don't understand it yet. And this kind of conspiracy mindset has a concrete ramifications. The Kremlin absolutely believed that when they launched their so-called special military operation, full-scale invasion, in February 2022, that most Ukrainians would greet them as liberators. They really believed this. And that's why they sent a very small army into Ukraine. 170,000 is absolutely small for a country the size of Ukraine, and when Ukraine then had already about 400,000 people under arms. If you think about it, Czechoslovakia, 1968, 10 million people compared to Ukraine's 45 million. 10 million people in Czechoslovakia, the Warsaw Pact invaded with 250,000 troops, so more than they invaded Ukraine in 2022. That Russia did not create this big army to invade Ukraine because they were absolutely convinced by their own mythology and stereotypes that most of these Ukrainians are little Russians who want to live in the Ruski Mir, in the Russian world, and they've just been prevented from doing so by a few of these Nazis from Western Ukraine, who were helped by the West. And once we come in, they'll run away, and then everything will be hunky-dory. Obviously, that's not true, but this is deeply believed still to this day, this kind of mythology in Russia. So, if we go back a bit in time, we should try to understand that this didn't just come from nowhere, didn't just begin in the last few years. In fact, Russia has been saying these things about the West, xenophobic about the West, since at least 2007. If you want to read a really fascinating speech, you can read Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference from February 2007, where he de facto says that Russia and the West are at war, not kind of directly at war, but in terms of ideology, in terms of hybrid warfare and such like. Certainly, this is his viewpoint, but very few people in the West at that time, right up until 2022, really wanted to believe this, that the West and Russia are somehow in different, incompatible worlds. This was a product of this rise of this anti-Western xenophobia was a product of the Kremlin seeing how they see it, the CIA, the West behind these various revolutions. First in Serbia against Milosevic, then in Georgia, and then of course in the Orange Revolution, and that pushed Russia to more towards nationalism. And then you saw this with Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference. And then you saw that with the first cyber attack in history was undertaken that year against Estonia. And then a year later, the invasion of Georgia. Xenophobically anti-Westernism, this anti-Western xenophobia has grown and grown and grown since then, and in particular in the last few years. The West is interfering. The West should get out. Russian imperial nationalists like Putin see the former USSR, Eurasia, as Russia's exclusive sphere of influence. Nobody should move in there. There should be no NATO, no EU, and no UN peacekeepers in that area. That belongs to Russia because that's an extension of Russian identity, of Great Russia, as it were. That's the source of Great Russia in many ways. And hence, the idea that NATO and EU could enlarge into this sphere of influence is anathema to the Kremlin. They've also used arguments about if the West can just invade Iraq without a UN authorization, why can we not do that? The Kosovo example is something that's been used all the time by Russia. If Kosovo can become independent, why cannot Crimea? Why cannot South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia? Because Kosovo was not a republic of Yugoslavia, it was an autonomous region of Serbia, and then it was made an exception and made an independent state. But countries like Ukraine have never recognized Kosovo as an independent country. It's been a controversial issue for many countries, not just Russia. But the idea you can compare Kosovo and Crimea is, of course, ludicrous. But Russia picks and chooses which parts of international law it wants to believe in. But this is a comical look at how Russia sees this.
Нападет на ядерную державу. Думай черепом. То есть не собирались нападать. Базы НАТО просто так приближаются. То есть хотели напасть. В Северной Корее одна бомба, и никто не нападает. Какой дурак к нам сунется? То есть нам ничто не угрожало. Весь мир против нас. Если не мы, то нас. Бьем на опережение. Нет нацизму, нет фашизму. Убить всех, сравнять всех с землей. Только по-человечески, по-божески. Мы многого не знаем, не все так однозначно. Просто Запад нам завидует, и все. Идем. Стой там, яма! Да что вы смотрите, ныряете, он плавать не умеет.
All of these kinds of myths and stereotypes led to an impression that both in Moscow and in West, where most Western policymakers are influenced not by Ukraine experts like myself, but by Russian experts. So these Russian experts in, shall we say, Washington and Berlin, as well as in Moscow, all got it wrong that the Russian army would quickly conquer Ukraine. I don't think there's any sound here, but basically every Russian journalist, every Russian leader was convinced 3 days and Kyiv would collapse. Of course, that did not happen, but the reason for this was this idea that somehow Ukraine identity is fake, artificial. Most Ukrainians are little Russians. They have been hoodwinked by the West into thinking they're separate, and they want to be part of the Russian world. They never expected as well, the Kremlin completely miscalculated about Western reaction to the war. They believed that would be a similar reaction to 2014, when the West was very weak in its sanctions against Russia. And this was one of the major mistakes of this war by the West, was that the weakness of Western reaction in 2014 to Russia's first invasion of Ukraine and occupation of Crimea led to a miscalculation in Moscow that they would again be a very weak reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was not true. The West imposed very tough Iranian-style sanctions on Russia, but this was a product of this weak signaling. The West wanted to continue doing business with Russia after 2014, as though nothing had really changed. Germany, for example, continued to build Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. So is the so-called special military operation, which was supposed to last a few days or a few weeks, now we're in its third year and it's not going anywhere. Is it going to plan?
Меня ничего не тревожит. Я думаю, что специальная военная операция идет по плану. Почему? Потому что, как объявил хозяин, денацификация идет по плану. Фашисты едут туда, там их убивают. Демилитаризация идет по плану. Туда везут танки, пушки, там их уничтожают. Все правильно. Чем меньше в России будет фашистов и оружия, тем лучше. Меня ничего не тревожит, я думаю.
The level of Russian casualties is simply mind-boggling. Over 10 years in Afghanistan, Soviet casualties, by here we mean killed and wounded, was 50,000, of which 15 were killed. In the war, which is not even 3 years yet in Ukraine, the casualty rate is 650,000. Now, where the difference is that for a Western army, for the Ukrainian army, most wounded soldiers are evacuated and they are kept alive. Russian wounded are simply left to die on the battlefield. So the Russian wounded die as well as the Russian killed. But we are talking at something like 1,200 Russian casualties a day, which is just simply mind-boggling. September was the second biggest casualty rate of the entire war, which has just taken place. And if you look on the right, this map, this casualty rate, which was huge in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, is just for this small bit of territory in red. And that has cost huge number of lives for a very small bit of territory. The Russia has been very humiliated in this war. When the war began, Russia claimed, and many of the so-called Russian experts in the West, both think tank and academic experts, were convinced that the Russian army was the second best in the world. We now see the Russian army is the second best in Ukraine, and with Ukrainian forces occupying the Kursk region of Russia, it's also the second best in Russia. So why did they get it wrong? Well, one of the major reasons they got it wrong, which has helped Ukraine, is that Russia is a mafia state. Russia was described as a mafia state in American diplomatic logs, cables, as far back as 2010. And that means that this isn't just corrupt. Most societies, most countries have corruption to varying degrees. This is a country which has corruption from top to bottom and literally permeates every aspect of society on the country. Why would it be right to assume that the Russian army is immune from this massive mafia state and corruption? Of course it's not. It's completely dominated by this corruption, which is the main reason why this Russian army was never the second best in the world. And Russia has as this great power, has had to go with a begging bowl to North Korea and Iran for weapons, for artillery shells in the case of North Korea, and for drones in the case of Iran. Russia is today China's younger brother, which is not something I think that many Russian nationalists would particularly like to see. There's a history of antagonism there, including in the Soviet Union, between the Soviet Union and China, and that is a product of how China is a rising great power, whereas Russia was a declining great power, and this war and this isolation from international trade and economic ties and the outflow of 1 million middle-class Russians in the fall of 2022 is speeded up this decline of Russia as a great power. So this is now Vladimir Putin. Why did it's, for me, it's more interesting. I mean, obviously it's interesting as well why Russian nationalists believed that Ukraine would be easily conquered. But I think for me, it's more interesting as a political scientist why so many Westerners got it wrong. They exaggerated the strength of the Russian army as the second best in the world, and they completely underestimated Ukrainian resilience, civil society, and patriotism. One of the major, I think, problems of the study of Ukraine in the last 30 years has been the exaggerated emphasis on studying regional and linguistic divisions in Ukraine, as though there's a kind of innate, deep antagonism between Russian and Ukrainian speakers, which there never was really. The Donbass region and Crimea were always quite unique regions of Ukraine, and they were not typical of even of the rest of eastern and southern Ukraine. I've done a lot of research, for example, in the Dnipropetrovsk region. There's a very strong Jewish influence there. Both Leonid Kuchma and Volodymyr Zelensky came from that region. It's next door to the Donbass, but very different in its identity, far more Ukrainian, and the Jewish community there has no nostalgia for the Soviet Union. Jews do not have nostalgia for a country that repressed and destroyed their religion and culture. They are pro-Ukrainian, even though most of them are pro-Russian speakers, like Zelensky was. They're pro-Ukrainian because independent Ukraine has permitted and has facilitated and has supported the revival of Jewish religion, language, and culture. As we see, if anybody goes to Dnipropetrovsk, now called Dnipro, they will see that. Um, and um, but these kinds of nuances were often missed, I think, by Western so-called experts. They exaggerated and this led to a kind of an imagination amongst many Western policymakers that the Russian army coming into Ukraine would be supported by Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine, not understanding that you can be a Russian speaker and still be a patriot of Ukraine. That does not make you pro-Putin. Most people in Ireland spoke English, but they were Irish patriots fighting against British rule. So I think this misconception of Russian speaker equals pro-Russian, therefore pro-Putin, was a major mistake. Um, Ukraine has had a massive military industrial complex in the Soviet Union. The biggest factory in the world that produced nuclear weapons was in Dnipropetrovsk. It was the last director of that factory was Leonid Kuchma. It was called Yuzhmash in Russian, in Ukrainian Pivdenmash. And so Ukraine's tradition of a military industrial complex, of the technicalities of the IT required for making complicated weapons has remained. This has been largely ignored by both Western experts and in Russia as well. It's as though Russian nationalists have this image of Ukraine as a country of peasants. Well, it's not, so Ukraine has been slowly building up its own independent military capacity again, sometimes with the financial help of Western partners. And I wrote an article published this week by Jamestown Foundation in Eurasia Daily Monitor that Ukraine now is the biggest producer of drones in the world. Ukraine produces at the moment 2 million drones a year, hopefully to rise to 4 million. That's more than any NATO member, including the US. and it's more than Russia. These are independently produced by a coalition of volunteers, civil society, private companies, government, and the military. And Ukraine is building long-range weapons and long-range drones up to 2,000 miles with distance 3,000 kilometers that can strike deep inside Russia. Trump will not decide the future of Ukraine, irrespective of what he thinks he will. It'll be Ukrainians themselves. And they will continue fighting. Let's look at Western policies about what have taken place in the last few years. I think the biggest problem is that Western countries, and this includes the US, have no strategy. What do they want from supporting Ukraine in this war? What is the final goal? The Biden administration has none. Some countries like Britain, Scandinavia, Poland, the Baltic states, they have an openly stated goal of Russia's military defeat. The Biden administration has never said that. Germany in particular doesn't want that. They're afraid of Russia's military defeat. They fear it would lead to some kind of civil war, chaos in Russia, and therefore, instability surrounding nuclear weapons. This has led to a drip supply of military equipment to Ukraine, rather than giving Ukraine everything that it could have had to win the war far quicker. This in particular was the case in the fall of 2022, when Ukraine forces liberated Kherson and Kharkiv, and when Russia had a very smaller army in Ukraine than it has now. If the West had supplied Ukraine with everything it had at the end of 2022, early 2023, the war may have been over by now, because Russia still at that stage had not mobilized a large army and sent it to Ukraine. Then it was about 175,000. Now we have over 400,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. So a big change. That was allowed to happen by this drip supply. The two big countries that fear some kind of Russian defeat have been US and Germany, and Germany has refused to send its Taurus long-range missiles. The US has sent them, but has refused to give permission for these to be used inside Russia, which many would argue is a way of kind of forcing Ukraine to fight a war with one arm up its back. Whereas Russia is just attacking Ukraine with thousands of missiles and drones every month, without Ukraine being able to really attack back. The West imposed far tougher sanctions, the kind of sanctions that were imposed against Iran in 2022, unlike in 2014, where barely any sanctions were imposed. But the impact of these sanctions has been mixed. The Russian economy continues to grow, for example. There's a lot of things are still getting through. When Ukrainians bring down Russian missiles and Russian drones, they often find quite a few Western components in there, including many American components. So how are these components still getting through from Western countries, including from the US? We have quite a lot of countries breaking Western sanctions, which have been ignored by the West. United Arab Emirates is a typical one. Turkey, China is a massive enabler of the war in Ukraine. Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Georgia. These countries have had a massive increase in trade with the West, and then they have re-exported all these goods to Russia. So breaking Western sanctions. These countries should be sanctioned by the West, but the EU and the US are basically turning a blind eye to this. The biggest impact probably has been on the energy question. Russian gas and oil exports to Europe since the Soviet era have accounted for about 40% of the Russian budget. And so Russia never expected the West to cut this gas and oil, these gas and oil exports to Europe. In 2022, in the Kremlin, they were saying Europe's going to freeze, it'll never do this. Well, it did. It was very difficult, but it did. Europe has found alternatives. American LNG, Norwegian gas, oil from Azerbaijan and elsewhere. So there have been alternatives have been found. 3 countries have continued to rely on Russian gas, pro-Russian: Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia. But this has been a major. So Russia has had to instead export its oil to countries like China and India at a very big discount. These are the big sanction busters. Germany continues to export lots to these sanction busting countries, and this is ignored. There's no way that small countries like Armenia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan can use all of these cars, washing machines, components, and that. And a lot of these components are dual use. China claims that it's only exporting dual use goods to Russia. Yes, but these dual use goods can be used in the Russian military. So, because the war didn't become a short war, as Kremlin imperial nationalists claimed it would be, because it wasn't a special military operation, it was actually a full-scale war, which has lasted 3 years already, not a few days. Russia has had to kind of broaden the ideological base of this war by saying this is a war against the so-called US-led unipolar world, and we will change this to a multipolar world where countries like China and Russia will be more respected and we will not be dictated to by the West. So that anti-Western xenophobia, which has been growing in Russia since 2007, has now permeated this entire war. And it's been based, a lot of this has been based on the view of Russian imperial nationalists that Ukraine is a fiction, Ukraine is a US puppet state, and that Ukrainians are artificial, and that if we kind of defeat the West, then Ukraine will no longer exist. Iran was eager, of course, to jump on this because Iran already had a kind of what it called an axis of resistance with Iran, Syria, and all of these various proxy groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. And then North Korea, very isolated. And China has tried to pretend it's sitting on the fence, but in fact, the main enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine is China. It is exporting the most in these dual use and other goods. And it's not true to say that China is trying to be somehow neutral. And China's the big hypocrite here, because the Chinese leaders are staunch supporters of territorial integrity of states, and at the same time they're supporting a country which is infringing that principle, which they claim is something, sacrosanct for China. The strangest country here is Israel. And not only because Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is Jewish. I mean, his entire family in World War II were murdered in the Holocaust. So you would think there would be sympathy from Israel for Zelensky, and there would be some kind of attempt to help. But Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has refused to help Ukraine. One reason is because he's a populist nationalist himself, and he was very much ideologically aligned with Putin for many years, under the fig leaf that we can't really do anything against Russia because Russia's in Syria. I don't believe that was really the real reason. There was a close ideological and other alliance between Netanyahu and Putin when Netanyahu campaigned for a re-election. Billboards went up in Israel with him shaking hands with Putin. That led to this shock on October 7th of last year when Hamas launched this brutal terrorist attack on Israel. Why would Russia support these Iranian proxy groups. Well, welcome to the real world, Mr. Netanyahu. You were trying to ignore the reality that Iran and Russia have had a military alliance since 2022. And that alliance is two ways. Both are sending, Russia's sending military equipment to Iran, which Iran needs. Iran is sending countless drones to Russia. And there have been reports in Bloomberg and elsewhere that Russia's even begun to supply nuclear weapon technology to Iran. For me, it's strange that Netanyahu and the Israeli leaders have not understood that this this axis of upheaval seeks the eradication and destruction of two countries, Israel and Ukraine. So they have a common interest to work together. Iran seeks to wipe Israel off the face of the map, genocide. Russia seeks the same thing in Ukraine. There should be a common interest of working together between both countries. But until now, that's not been the case. And I'm not even talking about sending, so we say, offensive military equipment to Ukraine, but at least sending some things like Iron Domes, sort of defensive anti-aircraft military equipment would be very helpful for Ukraine. But Netanyahu has refused until now. This is a bizarre video where you would not think that the Russia that we believed from the 1990s was integrating into the Western world, Russian middle class traveling throughout Europe, buying property in Europe, and yet now they are plugging North Korea as the big plus destination.
А вот так красив миллион. Да, бедная страна, но гордая. Возможность отправиться в Северную Корею вызвала ажиотаж среди россиян. Нам и рассказывают, что они живут в каменном веке, что у них нет там технологий, что, кстати, на картинке смотришь, вполне себе современные города. То есть какие широкие дороги. Дороги. Качественные дороги, и все у них там хорошо. Там и армия, и ракеты. Все хорошо. Да, вот все. Армия, ракеты, да, все. Хорошо.
Бархатцы, маргаритки и розы в клумбах, которые вполне могут составить конкуренцию Парижу и Берлину. Пахнет свежестью и нашим глубоким уважением к вождю.
Абсолютно нормальная, обычная жизнь, абсолютно обычные, нормальные люди.
Но вот просто повсюду люди на протяжении 30 километров с обеих сторон движения стоят люди. У нас есть люди, которые точно так же стремятся к свободе и независимости, как мы и обеспечивают. Вы понимаете, ведь идеология Северной Кореи – это свобода и независимость. Они изучают историю. И историю изучают такую, какая она была. Понимаете, там нету вот пересмотра всей истории, там нету, так сказать, подмены понятий. Даже наши дети в Приморске собрались ехать отдыхать в пионерский лагерь, Корейскую народно-демократическую. Я бы с удовольствием съездил. Это интересно.
Здесь чувствуешь себя больше, чем дома. 3 часа ночи, но в каждом окне каждого жилого дома горит свет. Вообще нет темных квартир.
Я другой такой страны не знаю.
Я другой такой страны. Это больно, 10 человек. Вот эта вот идеология Чучхе, опоры на собственные силы, это на самом деле то, о чем и мы тоже говорим. Это суверенитет. И отдельные элементы, они, конечно, перекликаются с идеями Путина. Да, люди бедно живут, но нужно все концентрировать, работать на оборону. Смотрите, какая симметрия. Владимир Путин и Ким Чен Ын стоят ровно под собственными портретами.
А для меня еще большая человеческая радость. Я наконец вижу мою любимую ведущую, которая таким торжественным голосом всегда объявляет. Ну, это отдельная культура, мне это очень нравится. И я прям удовольствие получаю.
안녕하세요.
려시와 한국 우민우 우정 만세.
정의하는 김정은 동지께서 울라지미르 비치 포첸 동지와 감격적인 상봉을 하셨습니다.
И, кстати, с другой стороны,
I think you got the message. A rather bizarre love fest with North Korea now taking place, promoted by the Kremlin in the Russian media. I've written about this. You can find this again in the Jamestown Foundation, how China is a major facilitator of Russia's war. It's trying to pretend it's not. It's trying to hide on the sidelines, unlike, say, North Korea and Iran. But that's not true. You can see this in the rising trade with Russia. Some of this is deliberately targeting, for the Russian military. And they're camouflaging this as dual use, but this is going to promote. Western experts on China believe that if China was tomorrow to end this trade, Russia would be unable to continue its war in Ukraine. So what unites, and we're now finishing, what unites this axis of upheaval that Putin had to kind of spread the war to, because it didn't go as planned, it didn't have a quick, short victory and take over so-called Little Russia, Ukraine? Well, they all agree, North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia, they all agree that this was the West that began this war, not Russia. Russia has never begun a war in history. Russia's always been the country that's had to suffer, that's been attacked. Russia was always the country that's defended itself. So this is a long-standing, I think, ideological premise of Russian colonial thinking. They all have a deep-seated anti-Americanism, this kind of Western hypocrisy that they all point to about Kosovo, Iraq, Libya. They all want to destroy what they call the US-led unipolar world, replace it with a kind of what they call a multipolar world, maybe what they see as existed in the Cold War, where you had different centers of power. And importantly, China, a lower communist country, is as much nationalist as is Russia. And so the idea that great powers like China and Russia have an innate right to spheres of influence. So a kind of a 19th century approach to this idea of spheres of influence. Russia's would be, of course, Eurasia. In the case of China, Southeast Asia, that whole region. I think what's important here in the context of the Trump campaign in the US, this idea in the Trump campaign that somehow you can park Russia and then just focus on China is a myth. You cannot separate these countries. They have one axis. They will work together. Russia will not betray its Chinese ally. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are now one unit. And the idea that somehow the Trump, if he was elected president, would be able to focus purely on China and ignore Russia is simply, again, one of the myths of the Trump campaign. And it's simply not going to happen in reality. They're going to continue working together. They see the West as a kind of an evil that they have to fight against. And Ukraine is seen as part of this Western sort of influence. On a final note, therefore, because many people now are talking about how to end this war, I think you see that there's a lot of mythology, and you see this with Donald Trump saying that if he's elected, he'll be able to end the war within a month or so. And he would do this by freezing the current conflict lines and then forcing Ukraine to give some territory to Russia. And then in return, Ukraine would get some kind of security guarantees. This is a complete myth. Russian imperial nationalists like Putin do not want only 20% of Ukraine. They want the whole of Ukraine. They want to destroy Ukraine. What Russia currently controls is not what they want. They don't control any major cities except, of course, Donetsk and Luhansk, which they conquered in 2014. In this current war, they've not conquered any big cities. The cities that they are eager to have in their imperialist mindset is Kharkiv, Odessa, and Kyiv, which they claim are Russian cities, particularly Kyiv, because Kyiv is the center of Kiev Rus, the big country which was 1,000 years ago. So the idea that the Kremlin would be happy to accept a peace deal where it just continued to control 20% of Ukraine and not these big so-called Russian cities is a myth that the Trump campaign are promoting and has no basis in reality. We do have the reality that we continue to have this drip kind of supply of weapons to Ukraine. The US and which is one reason why Zelensky and Ukraine are building up their own domestic military industrial complex. The US and Germany will continue to fear this so-called escalation and Russia's military defeat. The war will continue as long as Putin is president, and he's president for life. He will never leave that office. He's legally in power till 2035, and I'm sure the constitution will be changed again for him to continue to be Russian leader. As long as Putin is Russian leader, this war will continue. He has an obsession with Ukraine, and he wants to destroy Ukraine and defeat the West. He cannot step back from that, because if he did, it would be the end of Putin. And he wants to go into history as the new Stalin, the new Peter the Great, the new Catherine, the one who expanded Russia's borders and who rebuilt Russia as a great power. That's his kind of mania in his head. So the current Western policy of dealing with Russia, which has been going on for 3 years, will actually just perpetuate this forever war in Ukraine, with no goal of Russia's military defeat, with this drip supply of weaponry to Ukraine. It really favors Russia, not Ukraine. Russia has a bigger population. It has a population which has been zombified through propaganda, which is willing to die in huge numbers. Ukraine, yes, has a technical edge. It has a volunteer civil society, which Russia doesn't have. But nevertheless, a forever war is not good for Ukraine. It means more people dead, civilians and military, destruction, and people who have fled to the West will not return to Ukraine, the millions of people. So this Western policy, I don't think, is working. It was in Ukraine's interest to finish the war as quickly as possible. And President Zelensky is therefore talking about how he will try to do that by next year. And somehow, by some kind of maybe new offensive next year, because this year there's only about a month left of military activity until winter happens. But of course, what does victory mean? Does that mean the liberation of all Ukrainian territories? Does it mean Ukraine joins NATO, gets security guarantees? All of these are questions now being debated. Ukrainians are very suspicious of security guarantees because these were given to Ukraine in 1994 in return for denuclearization. People don't remember, but in 1994, Ukraine had the third biggest nuclear weapon arsenal in the world. It gave that up in exchange for security guarantees, which were ignored by Obama and British Prime Minister Cameron in 2014. So Ukraine's very suspicious of security guarantees and thinks that the only real guarantee is NATO membership. Is that possible with part of your territory occupied? The example given there is Germany. After World War II, Western Germany joined NATO when Eastern Germany was still under Soviet occupation. And that Soviet occupation lasted until 1990. So maybe the West German approach is possible, not the North Korean, South Korean approach, which is not something I think Ukrainians would support. So we are still in this kind of mixed transitional phase. We shall see who wins the US elections. Whoever wins, Trump will try to do what he claims he wants to do, end this war, based on the fiction that he somehow is able to do a deal with Putin and get Putin to agree. I think he's completely wrong. Putin will never agree to a deal which gives Russia only 20% of Ukraine. Russia wants to destroy Ukraine. Harris, on the other hand, will probably continue Biden's drip policy, which is better, but at the same time, it would continue this forever war, which Ukrainians don't really want. Ukrainians and their European neighbors would prefer this war to end quickly. So on that note, we shall see who wins the US elections, but I don't believe the US elections, irrespective of who wins, will ultimately decide the fate of Ukraine. That will be decided by Ukrainians themselves. Because irrespective, even if there's no more US military aid, Ukrainians will continue fighting. They won't finish give up. They won't capitulate. This is an existential war. Russia aims to commit genocide, aims to destroy Ukraine and Ukrainian identity. Ukrainians will never give up fighting against that. Thank you very much for listening. If there are questions, I'm happy to reply to these, even later by email or otherwise. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuzio. This was fascinating and brilliant, and I'm speechless, but we might have time for a couple of questions from our co-hosts or comments. Please open your camera and microphone. Katerina.
Bravo. Not only the content, but how you deliver it. You are just such a masterful speaker. I'm so grateful to you. I feel very, very much educated on things I thought I understood fully, but it didn't. Thank you. This was fantastic. As Victor
It's a very
says,
complicated subject. It's complicated. I mean, there are so many aspects to this.
But what I've never heard before was that that no matter what Trump says, he'll end the war on day one. That it's just not. I've never actually heard anybody explain why that's just not possible. And you have, and it's actually now that you've explained it, it makes perfect sense. But it's interesting. It's funny because I just like I think there is this fear in my generation of Ukrainian Americans of, if he wins, then there will be some terrible deal for Ukraine. But I love what you said, that Ukrainians will decide their own fate, and that's very heartening. It's also the whole situation is terrible and sad, and the loss of life is immense. So this drip, drip, drip approach so far, that the support that it's been kind of so gradual, what do you think it will take? And I know it's hard to speculate who's going to be in the White House, but what do you think it would take to convince the U.S. to abandon the drip, drip, drip approach and just wholeheartedly support Ukraine? What do you think it would? Is there anything that could happen?
American military senior American military leaders have outlined the kind of weaponry America has that they think should be given to Ukraine to facilitate a quicker ending to the war. This was actually published in CNN this week, so you can easily look that up. I mean, I'm not, all of these different types of weaponry are a bit above my pay grade, but they say that America has not given many of the things that it could have given that Ukraine could use. I mean, there's like thousands of Bradley armored personnel carriers sitting in the desert, I think in Nevada, just stored there for a future war. That could have, a lot more could have been given. Ukraine was given maybe a couple of hundred or something. So there's lots of things like that. It's not just the drip drip, but also the small amounts. I mean, Russia goes through a huge amount of military equipment that gets destroyed. Ukraine has to be more cautious in that. So the only way you can defeat a country with a larger kind of mass of people is by technical superiority, by technical means. Ukraine is doing that to some degree. As I say, the level of technical development in Ukraine is massive. If you look up my article on drones this week was published, Ukraine is in the lead in the world on this. When this war ends, Ukraine will have an incredible export of military equipment. It will be competing with the US and Western countries, and Ukrainian military advisors will be in every NATO member state. Because no NATO member state has ever fought a real war like this. They've only fought insurgencies like in Iraq or Afghanistan, not a real proper war. So I think it's levels of equipment. The European, I think Trump is also misleading when he talks about how the US has given the most. That's not true. There are two aspects to aid to Ukraine: military aid and economic financial aid, because you need to keep the budget afloat. If Ukraine is spending so much on the military, then it needs money to spend on non-military issues. And the European Union has been giving far more money for budgetary support for the Ukrainian government budget than the US has. So Trump doesn't know the picture. Of course, he's not famous for doing much research. He brags about never reading books. And the Trump-Vance campaign simply don't understand the deep roots of this war, which lie in Russian imperial nationalism, Russian imperial denial of the existence of a Ukrainian people and Ukrainian state. So hence, Putin will never agree to a peace deal where he only gets 20% and half of Zaporizhia and half of Kherson. That's not what he wants. He wants Kyiv, he wants Odessa, he wants Kharkiv. So Trump's living in a fantasy world.
Thank you. Thank you for breaking that down. I just put a link to the article. It looks like it's reprinted in Ukrainian Quarterly in the chat for
Right.
our viewers. And I want to thank you for sharing those amazing video clips. I mean, such a great collection of you curated such a great collection of video clips that are informative and boy, just very, very enlightening. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time with us. This has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kuzio. It is late on your side of the Atlantic, and we wish you all the best. And again, we are honored by you talking to us, and we will have recording on time.
Okay,
I will
thank
ask
you for
now.
inviting me.
Thank you. I will ask now Dr. Shrey to say our customary greeting to Ukrainian viewers. Please, Katerina.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні.
Героям слава.
And Putin, we know. Okay, so we are finished now, I think, yeah.
I'm stopping.